Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Merrill Pipcorn, welcoming you to the Indigenous Peoples Day Lunch and Learn, Understanding Intergenerational Trauma. Now, I understand that everyone has been asked to view the film Elbow Woods, about the 1942 Elbow Woods basketball team. And it does a great job of describing, and during the film, of describing much of the topic that we're discussing today is this intergenerational trauma. And so that I hope that you have watched it. If you haven't watched it, you'll probably want to after the discussion today. I'm going to tell you just a little bit about the film and why it was made in the first place. The official name of the film was Basketball, Water, and the Lost City of Elbow Woods. And Elbow Woods is a town, I guess more accurately described as was a town, since it is currently under water of the Lake Akawea. And I see one of the early questions submitted was, does Elbow Woods still exist? Well, the buildings are still there, and in times of low water, you can actually see some of those buildings beneath the surface of the water. But for all practical purposes, Elbow Woods is gone. I first learned about this 1942 Elbow Woods basketball team because of an article that the curator of the Three Affiliated Tribes Museum wrote probably about 20 years ago. And I came across it just kind of by happenstance. And I'm just struggling. I don't have her name written down. Marilyn Hudson. Excuse me, Marilyn. If Marilyn is watching, excuse me. I don't think I've ever forgotten her name. She is just a real passionate about preserving the history of the three affiliated tribes and telling the story of all aspects of the three affiliated tribes. She is now the recently retired head of the museum, but she still keeps what's going there. At any rate, I read this article about this 1942 Elbow Woods basketball team, and then proceeded to talk to Marilyn and call her, and I did an interview with Marilyn, and we decided then and there, some 20 years ago, that this was a story that needed to be told to a broader audience than just a few people reading this article. And to make a film of it. Well, a documentary film. It took nearly 20 years to get the job done, to get the film made so that this could indeed be told to a broader audience. But it certainly was worth the effort. It's just a testament to those things that say, a good idea is worth hanging on to and persevering until it's accomplished. So I'm very proud of Marilyn for sticking with me for it. And of course, it could never have been made without the cooperation and encouragement from the three affiliated tribes leadership. Current chairman is Mark Fox, and his father and uncle played on this 1942 team. And of course, he was very closely connected to the story. Without their aggressive pursuit of getting this film done, it never would have been done also. So much thanks to the tribe on that. In a nutshell, for the few of you who may not have seen the film, or just to refresh your memory very briefly, the 1942 Elbow Woods basketball team was a groundbreaking team. They were very exciting and had a lot of fun. They were good sports and really exemplified the spirit of the athlete, the Native American athlete, and especially on the basketball court. They went all the way through the regular season, lost a couple of games along the way, but made it to the state tournament. They made it to the championship game of the tournament, where they lost by 1 point. A couple of weeks after the tournament, so in other words, they were the runners-up in that 1942 state basketball tournament. It turns out a couple of weeks after the tournament, the tournament champion, Lakota, was found to have had an ineligible player, a 20-year-old player. Now, that sounds old, but in those days you could play until you turned 20. And it turns out that this player had been playing for Lakota for quite some time that season. That some people are wondering, well, did he even know? And it's possible that he didn't, but nonetheless, he was ineligible. It turns out that one of the star Lakota players, one of the star Elba Woods players turned, I believe it was Johnny Rabbithead, turned 20 on the day of the championship game. And his coach had to bench him. So Elba Woods was without their star player for that championship game, and he wound up losing it by a point. At any rate, after some time, Dakota had to vacate the championship, leaving 1942 as the only year in the North Dakota High School Association activities yearbook that's published, well, every year. There was just a blank line there, a line going through it. No champion that year. So several years later, the tribe pursued the fact that they should be named champions. And then back in 2012, I believe it was, the North Dakota High School Activities Association did indeed name Elba Woods the 1942 state champions. It was a long and arduous process, and finally successful. So that is kind of the root. That is the basis of the film, Elba Woods. And in the film itself, of course, some of the athletes, none of the basketball players were still living by the time the film got made. And they have a little dog in the background wanting to go outside. My wife just came in. We have a busy office around here at home, don't we? But none of the athletes, none of the players of that team were alive, but several of their children were, nieces and nephews, and other relatives. And they were, of course, a big part of the story. So that said, that was the kickoff point for the film, and is kind of the kickoff point for today's discussion on intergenerational trauma. And we have several panelists on board today, and I will introduce them to you now, and then they will introduce themselves. You want to catch the door on your way out. The panelists are Sharon Whitebear. She's going to be coming up a little bit later on. Holly Mackey, Brandon Beatty, and Whitney Fear. So, Holly, if you want to go first and just introduce yourself. Oh, and I should say before we do introduce ourselves, we'll have a little more information on how we'll be interacting with each other. We'll have a long Q&A session following the introductions here too. So again, Holly, if you want to go ahead and introduce yourself, that'd be great.
Yes, thank you. I was actually like, maybe I'll go alphabetical and I won't have to go first. It's pressure here. It's an important day, and I want to thank Fargo-Moorhead City and Indigenous Association and all of the people who made this happen. So I've only lived in Fargo a year, and I come originally from the Northern Cheyenne Nation in Montana, but I'm very proud to be here, and I'm very proud that Indigenous Association in particular has taken such an active role in trying to provide resources and information, right, to our communities. As I said, I'm Northern Cheyenne, and I was named Notame originally. My mother's Iris Westica, and I'm also Zuni. And so on my Zuni side, I come from a long line of fetish carvers, the Westica family. They're one of the primary historical fetish carvers through history. And I'm very proud of that, but I'm also very proud of the fact that recently in ceremony I was given a new name, and by the Lakota relatives that I have, and so now my name is Wambly, and I carry that very proudly because of how it happened. And I think that it's important when we have these spaces to acknowledge, right, the ways that all of our tribes are coming together and working in solidarity to try to make sure that these issues are brought forward. I'm on faculty at NDSU, and I came to NDSU from Oklahoma, much like the football coach, right, or the basketball coach, I'm sorry, in the movie. And when I was in Oklahoma, I was unable to actually work with tribes due to some of the state politics. And so I wanted to come to a space where I could actually work within a university that wanted to support Indigenous teachers, right, and developing Indigenous leaders for our tribal communities. And so when I had the opportunity to move back north and move closer to family and back to the tribes with whom my roots are more aligned, I certainly jumped at the chance. And with that, into the community, you know, just trying to bring your strengths and contribute where you can. There are a number of ways that I've tried. So I sit on the National Indian Education Study Technical Review Panel. So it's a group of Native experts from across the country. And what we do is we work with the NAEP test. The National Indian Education Study is a subsection of NAEP. And in recent years, we've been able to actually incorporate a preamble or a preface to that report that talks about the ways that the data doesn't actually tell the story of our Native communities and our Native students' achievement. And so this movie really struck me in that way, where it spoke about how well the school was flourishing, how well the students were doing, right? And then in that moment, it was taken from them. And so, I mean, you know, bios can go really long, and I don't want to take time for that. But I do want to say that I've been an activist scholar for 15 years. I've worked and published and done all of my research in Indian education. I first started working with Montana's Indian Education for All, which is my aunt was an avid state representative, making sure that that was finally funded in 2002 after 30 years. And I've had the opportunity to work with her, Norma Bixby, and great leaders like Henrietta Mann and Peggy Azure, and all of those people who have fought so hard for so long to make sure that Indian education isn't something that's forgotten. So I'm very, very proud to be here, humbled to be here, and excited to have this conversation, because I think these are conversations that oftentimes we aren't having, right, on a regular basis.
Okay, thank you very much, Holly. And you mentioned in there the government action on part of your family as well. And that's one of the questions that was submitted early, is about the recruitment. Do you believe that the recruitment of Indigenous peoples into government is an important goal? So we're going to talk about that a little bit later. I'll have something to add along those lines as well. So thanks for bringing that up. Okay, let's meet our next panelist, Brandon. You ready to tell us a little bit about yourself?
Yeah, so I'm Brandon Beatty. I am Anishinaabe. I'm a descendant from White Earth Nation, not too far from here. But I actually grew up in the Twin Cities. So most of my life, just pretty much living in kind of the suburbs and in the city itself. I've worked in several different, I'm a licensed social worker, and I've worked with youth pretty much the whole time that I've been a social worker. I really enjoy working with youth. I love the chaotic energy of working with youth. If you've ever worked with youth, you know it. And if you love it, you love it. If you don't, then you get out of there pretty quick. Some of the biggest things that interest me, and the reason I think, as I was watching the film, just how historical trauma and different things in our lives affect how we function day to day. Because that's what I see. I see a lot in my work, like people who are not necessarily functioning to the level that gets them what they want and gets them what they need, so they can accomplish their goals. And that's a very social worky way of saying it, but essentially, I like seeing people thrive and grow and work toward a life that they want, and help them overcome some of those barriers that they face. So. Yeah, I currently work at YouthWorks in Fargo, and yeah, that's about it.
Okay, that's enough for now. I'm sure we'll learn more about you too as you answer some of the questions that have been presented. I have a lot of respect for and gratitude for, for example, for Holly being involved as a instructor, in a university, for Brandon being involved, with the youth. It's a lot of dedication to just to get into that and be part of that world. So we appreciate that. Whitney Fear was part of our panel last year, I believe. And Whitney, you want to tell us about yourself?
Sure. So my name is Whitney Fear. I'm a board certified psychiatric nurse practitioner, and my practice is at Family Health Care. This time last year, I was in between like transitioning between being a nurse and a nurse practitioner. So it's been almost a year since I made that transition. So prior to this, I was a nurse for about 10 years and worked primarily in the arenas of community and public health and behavioral health. I grew up on the Pine Ridge Reservation, which is really big, but it's hard to be really precise of what part of that huge reservation I'm from, because I grew up out in the middle of nowhere. My parents have raised cattle, so we lived like 40 miles from a town. So I moved to Fargo about 15 years ago. And why Fargo? Well, I needed to live anywhere else but the reservation. I barely graduated high school. I had like a 0.5 GPA when I was a sophomore in high school because I had missed so many days. I was drinking excessively all the time, and just really angry, sad about life, I guess, on a daily basis. It's really that's kind of the part of the film that really resonates with me, because things like basketball and things that seem kind of minuscule, I guess, as far as the public perception about how much of a difference can they make. They do make a huge difference. Those kind of programs keep kids in school and provide a means for interacting with different adults and being able to have different figures in their life. And I was really fortunate in that I had some healthy people in my family that were helpful, but I had classmates and I had people I grew up with that unfortunately didn't have anybody that was in that space when they were growing up. So basketball coaches and football coaches and teachers and people like that were really instrumental in their success. So it does make a huge difference. And as a healthcare professional, we see that it's less about your genetics and more about your zip code as far as how healthy you're going to be. Great example from North Dakota is that people in Fort Yates live about 20 years less than people in Bismarck, and that's not very far away from one another. But yeah, the average life expectancy is about 20 years less between those two places. So yeah, it's a subject I'm really passionate about, just as I do, mental health primarily now. The reason I wanted to pursue my degree is that nurse practitioner. This nurse practitioner approach is holistic, so it's not systems based as typical medicine is, and so nurse practitioner practice really rooted in the whole person, so body, mind, spirit, all being kind of influencing one another, and that's something that's a traditional view of my people, Lakota people. That if your spirit's sick, your mind will be sick, your body will be sick, and so on and so forth. So yeah, I'm really looking forward to the discussion today. And yeah, thank you again for being our host, Meryl.
Well, I'm not exactly your host. I am moderating. Fortunately, I don't have control over the technology, but Kathleen Christie has control of that. But I'm also thrilled just to be part of it and to see this Elbow Woods film, being part of it as well, at least being kickstarting today's 2-hour session, hour and a half, 2-hour session. I look forward to a fantastic discussion. And I see, speaking of which, Sharon Whitebear was engaged earlier in another meeting, and that apparently is out, or else you just ducked out of it, Sharon. We're not sure which, but at any rate, you are here, and we're just going around and introducing ourselves. So Sharon Whitebear, if you want to say a few words about yourself, she's our last panelist here today. And then we're going to get to the questions. We have a couple of old questions we're going to be asking you too. Sharon?
Okay, thank you, Senator. My name is Sharon Whitebear. My native name is Holy Shawl Woman, and I'm a Rikara from the Rikara Nation, the Mandan, Hidatsa, and the Rikara. And I live here in Fargo, and I'm just proud of being part of this day today, the Indigenous Peoples Day. I'm also glad that we have this panel because one of the things we really wanted to do when we were doing this was to make sure that we had education as part of our Indigenous Peoples Day so that people could learn and understand about what's happening and if they have questions. So we want to continue throughout this time to always educate about our culture. And so that's some of the things I do. I work here at the East Segment Satellite Office for the MHA Nation. I'm happy to be helping people. It seems like I kind of found another niche. I used to work in surgery, and now I love helping the people, trying to make things easier for Native people in this community, and that's what I love doing. So thank you for having me on the panel.
Thank you, Sharon. Now, my name, Merrill Pepcorn. I do not have a native name, but my wife does, because I asked a friend of mine who I believe it is in the Lakota language, and she is that lives up near Newtown, Fort Berthold Reservation. And I asked her for the native name for my wife's eyes, which I described as, you know, they sparkle, they dance, and so she gave me this name to give to Connie as Ishtawachipi, which I believe then stands for dancing eyes. So my wife does have at least a native name. So there we are. Okay, before we get to some of the questions that you have submitted, and you may submit questions as we do continue today. I believe Kathleen will confirm or deny this by way of the chat box. But before we do that, Kathleen has a couple of poll questions that she would like you to answer, and we'll take a poll today as we go. So, Kathleen. The first question is this the first time you've heard the story of the lost city of Elba Woods? And probably will be just answer it now. And should be able to. That is this the first time you've heard the story of the lost city of Elba Woods? Just simply yes or no. And I wouldn't be surprised if it is perhaps the first time that it has happened. Okay. Quick poll. Did you have another question, Kathleen, as well? Or is that it for now? Okay, here we are. Okay. How comfortable are you asking questions and discussing these kinds of Indigenous issues? Again, uncomfortable, somewhat comfortable, or comfortable. So a single answer is required, as you see on your screens. How comfortable are you asking questions and discussing these kinds of Indigenous issues? Uncomfortable, somewhat comfortable, or comfortable? So there you go. Hope you've had got on the ball there and answered those questions. I am going to start now. You were asked to submit questions before the panel began today, and we'll just go around. I'm going to probably ask each of you to answer a question first, so we're not putting the burden on one person in particular to answer first all the time. But and anyone can kind of really jump in if they want to add to this. So, Aaron, we started last with you for the introduction. So let's start first with you with our first question, which was submitted earlier before the panel began here today. And this is really the crux of the whole discussion. And I can certainly benefit from this as well. What does intergenerational or historical trauma mean? Again, what does historical trauma or intergenerational trauma mean? Well, Aaron, if you want to give us a few words on that?
Yes, I would. First, the intergenerational trauma is from our ancestors. It's been passed down through each generation. This trauma has continued. So it's intergenerational besides, just, it's not about just when the government started, pushing us off our lands. And it's been many years before that, as people came and met with the natives, that the traumas that they had to endure, not even being citizens of the United States at some point, not even be considered as people. So that's been passed on through the years. It affected one generation. That generation had a hard time trying to deal with that, which affected the next generation in what they originally would have done for the ancestors, their teachings, their cultural ways, those kinds of things. And so as it went along in those years, we had a lot of trauma when it came to when the Christians came and they wanted to take a lot of they did take a lot of the children and tried to assimilate them into Western culture. And so to me, it's through history, and it's through each generation how it affected it. So that's intergenerational and historic trauma, and it still continues today. I want to say, I think you've seen it in a few places nationally. One of the most recently is when they had the challenge against the oil industry here in North Dakota and the Water is Life movement. That's one of the times you could see the difference in how the Native people are treated when it comes to their lands, something they really believe in, and how the government, depending on what they wanted the oil, they wanted to be able to just have it. And then you could see that how things had been through that. So it continues today in all kinds of ways, through the government, through our schools. So thank you.
Okay, who would like to add on to that? Either Whitney, Chelsea, Brandon? Describing or defining intergenerational drama or intergenerational or historical trauma.
I can add on to it if you'd like.
Sure.
So for me, historical trauma kind of makes me think about how we all live in a way, and we have our cycles of life and the ways that we live, and those being disrupted in some way. And as they're being disrupted, it takes away the ability for the people to be safe, thrive, live in a way that feels right to them. And with every psychological hurt or like big historical trauma, such as like land being taken away, having people sent to residential schools, things like that, it all disrupted the way of life of lots of people. And I think that, not just at that time causing harm and distress and lots and lots of really bad consequences, but also in the future, because as you try to maintain those cycles of life, maintain safety and figure out how to live, everyone still has in the back of their mind, like, this could happen. So you're living your life in a way that's always trying to protect yourself from that trauma that you've received in the past, not necessarily directly, but through stories and through your ancestors and through people that you've known. We learn, we're human, we're social beings, and if we see something as a threat in our lives, we're definitely going to remember it. We're programmed to remember those threats. And so then, we live life in a way that is anticipating those threats. So I think that, and it's not always something that's like a behavior and action that's necessarily functional, or like a way that makes it so you can live your best life. It's just a way that you protect yourselves from receiving the same sort of trauma. So that's kind of my understanding of historical trauma, is just just how big events affect generations of people, and the consequences of that.
Okay, before we have either Holly or Whitney respond to that, I will let you know that up to this point, I think probably most people are in who are going to answer the first poll question is this the first time you've heard of the Elbawood story? For 88% of you, yes, this was the first time you've heard about this story, and 12% saying no, you've heard about it before. So that's pretty interesting. Hope you have enjoyed the film and learned from it as I did. Okay, back to the question of describing or defining intergenerational or historical trauma. Whitney, you want to give it a shot from your point of view?
Sure. So, I guess as a professional, like coming from that world, we found out so much more about the systemic effects of trauma and the stress from that. As Brandon was describing, there's these behaviors and reactions that can come from that history, and it's not necessarily that those behaviors or reactions are functional at all, but they're very much something that people typically don't really have a whole lot of control over, because of the release of chemicals in our body that drive those reactions. If you tell someone to settle down when they've had a massive release of epinephrine and norepinephrine, it's just not going to happen, because their heart rate is beating over probably 120, 130 beats a minute. Their blood pressure is through the roof. Their pupils are dilated, the little hairs in their ears are standing up, their hearing is sharper, they're ready to run or fight, one of the two. So it just won't happen. And that memory, they used to feel like, when they first started studying this, scientists thought, well, it's primarily because people pass on these stories and then kids learn them. But there was families where none of that retelling had happened. And actually that research started coming out of survivors of the Holocaust who had not told their grandchildren or children anything about their experiences in concentration camps. But whenever they looked at MRIs of the survivors and their descendants and exposed them to the same reminders of trauma, they had the exact same response almost in their brain. So there is now this concept that like our cells have that memory programmed, whether or not our people tell us about those things. So that can be really overwhelming. And I think then from a personal perspective, intergenerational trauma means to me like a big loss of identity. My family was exposed to things like boarding school very early on. My grandma's father and his brothers all went to Carlisle boarding school almost right after it was opened. And that was notoriously probably one of the worst boarding schools in the United States. One of his brothers died there from measles, that they told his parents they gave it to him by sending him a letter. So he had that guilt. I think that guilt. And my grandma described her father as being a self-loathing, very angry man who hated that he was Lakota and wanted nothing to do about it. My grandma's mother was very traditional. And so he was very violent towards her and towards the children whenever they displayed any reminders of the fact that he and his wife and his children were Native. And so, that perpetuated it on my dad's side of the family as well. Went to boarding school very early on, and we don't have, like, we just have, I feel like, fragments of our culture left in our family. And it's really difficult to know, like, where do you start to get that back, or how do you get that back? Because you know, and then it feels kind of terrible because in a sense, I feel some envy of people who have more of their culture, because they like it's just it's an hard to describe feeling, like when you long for something that you have never had, long for those things, and exposure to those things. And when you do get them, it's really like it's powerful. And Sharon was talking about Standing Rock. I went out there with my friend Audra and a couple other ladies, and we were there the day that President Obama issued the executive order to halt the pipeline. And in that moment, they were talking right before that about how this had been the largest kind of gathering of so many people, and the Lakota had like formally reconciled with the Crow and the Ojibwe, and there was a lot of unity. And it was probably one of the best moments of my life, I think, because it was I felt so part and of something so big. And I remember when I was telling my grandma about it, she cried. She said that she didn't think that anything like that would ever happen to anybody in her family, and she was so happy about it. She herself was a boarding school survivor. It was really powerful for her too. So it's a very complicated issue. But yeah, I do think that I'm happy to see all the research being done, but I think that's really important. And I'm extra happy to see so much involvement from Native professionals in that research.
Okay, thanks, Whitney. And it's a reminder to me that this is not ancient history. This is relatively recent history. This wasn't that long ago. So for someone like me, that's important that I understand and realize that. And let's see, we still have Holly. Do you want to chip in on this one? Do you remember the topic is defining intergenerational or?
Well, you know, and I don't know that I, like with my background and expertise, defining it, right? I think that the other panelists have done a very good job, because I'm a teacher, right? I'm in education, I'm in educational leadership, and I focus in policy. So I think, you know, my thought on this actually is defining it in terms of being an interdisciplinary issue, like that we need to address. And so the part of this panel that I think is most exciting to me is the fact that we have a multitude of professions represented, because if we're going to overcome it, obviously we need to have the same interdisciplinary approach as the interdisciplinary actions and policies that caused the trauma in the first place. But in terms of schools, right, and just kind of, you know, building a little bit on what the other panelists have said, we see it manifested where we have like this long-term imprint, right, of intergenerational trauma, and we know our stories somewhat, right, and some people don't know their stories at all. But then in terms of public schools in particular, right, our students are then faced with continued trauma, right, that compounds that intergenerational trauma. So we have the lost languages, we have the lost history, the lost cultures, and we have a school curriculum that's predicated on maintaining the myth of American exceptionality and westward expansion, and this broad story that continues to erase students. And when we think about the ways that we walk through the world, where if everything is ceremony, right, our students are then forced to remove themselves from being fully present in schools, and we have the boarding school effect that we see oftentimes, which is interpreted by non-native educators, right, as being parents who don't care or kids who don't want to learn. And when we think about intergenerational trauma, and we have to think about all of the experiences that have created the conditions of mistrust, right, moving forward, I think is very difficult, because we have kids who want to learn, we have families who are fully committed, right, to education. We want all of the things for our children that everybody wants for their children. So not only are we dealing with intergenerational trauma that's coming through and then intersecting with health and social services and cultural, like all of these things come together. And that's just a fact, like we know that, but what we don't think about is the way that we reify that trauma every single day that our kids step foot into schools. and the ways that our curriculum continues to make them invisible, the ways that even fighting for Indigenous Peoples Day is something that the President of the United States will issue an executive order to denounce, right? And so if we're wanting to actually meet the needs of our tribal communities and our Native students, we have to think about the ways that not only do we have to address intergenerational trauma, but we have to address the fact that those who often care the most are somewhat complicit in compounding that trauma on a daily basis despite best intentions.
We've been asked to ask each of you how some of these things that you can relate to personally. The question is, can you describe a personal experience? And some of you have touched on this already, how this is maybe affecting personally. You describe a personal experience or scenario that captures the context of intergenerational trauma as we continue to describe this a bit. But Kathleen Christie has also reminded me to remind you that, you know, this is a safe place to ask questions. And if you want to ask a question, and of course our panelists would be happy to do their best to answer that. So you can ask a question now, I have several of them here that have already been sent in, but if something comes to mind today, right now, as we are speaking, please use your chat box to ask a question, and we can talk about that as well. And Catlin, I don't know if you have the responses to the second question yet, feel about, you know, discussing these things. Not at all. However, that poll turned out, maybe you can give me those as well. But I think I started with, did I start with you, Brandon, on this one? I can't remember, but at any rate, let's go to Brandon and ask about you. What does it mean personally to you if you can describe a personal experience or scenario that captures the context of intergenerational trauma, which I think we have a better understanding of which now than we did before we asked the question. So thanks for that, panelists. But Brandon?
Yeah, so I've been thinking about this a lot, and I've been hearing a lot about like being erased and just kind of like not existing. I think that's the biggest personal effect of intergenerational trauma for me. I grew up when I was very little. My grandma lived with us, and I remember just very, 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 very in like the borders of my memory. My grandma making me say miigwech instead of thank you every time I spoke to her. There were a few other words that I had to say in Ojibwe, just like how it was in the house because she lived with us. And after that, like after she passed from drinking, like a disease related to drinking too much, alcoholism, and after that, my nativeness or my indigenousness, if you say that, was always a question. Like I had my grandma there when I was little to tell me like, yes, you're native, you are one of us. This is our culture. This is who we are. And then I had my dad who kind of grew up in, he's 60 something now, mid 60s. So he grew up in a time, I think, where being Native American was looked at like very, very much publicly looked down upon. Like, I remember him talking about like no Indians allowed in like certain stores and things like that. And so he just downplayed it, and he would acknowledge that we were Ojibwe, but when I asked questions about family, about traditions, about different things like that, he gave me like just answers to placate me, and then didn't really explore it much further. So I think part of it too is because he also like my grandma. So my dad was not full-blooded, the whole blood quantum type thing. So then he kind of felt like from his half brothers and sisters, I think that he wasn't Native enough because they were kind of modeling that idea of like you need to be full-blooded to really be Native, and then it just kind of passed down to me. So I think throughout my time as being a young man and even a young adult, I had this part of me where I knew I was Indigenous. I had memories of my grandma. I have different things, and I didn't feel like I could fully access it. And I think that that was the intended cause for some of the things that happened in the past, to make sure that we aren't really identified as Indigenous and as a people with a culture. And I've been working hard in my, in my 20s and now in my 30s to rediscover, what does that mean? Like, who am I? I am Indigenous. I am, yeah, and I'm white, and I didn't grow up on the res. I grew up in the city. Like it's just this really interesting, complex idea, and I think that's what brings me to want to work with kids and help them discover their culture as well, so they don't have to wait until they're in their mid-20s, early 30s to really say yes, this is me, this is who I am, these are my people, this is my family, these are my traditions and my cultures, and I can have them, and they're part of me.
Brandon, let me ask you this and stay with you here for a little bit. How's it going as you try to communicate with these young people now to get and to understand some of these things that you didn't get a handle on until you were older? How's that process going? How's it being received by the younger ones?
I feel like they're very hungry for it. I feel like you start talking in a way that's like, hey, this is part of Indigenous culture. This is like part of who you are. It's not something to be ashamed of. It's not something that, it doesn't mean that you're going to be this or that, or, whatever the stereotypes are. This means that we have this rich heritage and this rich culture that we can draw strength from. And having adults in their lives see that from adults in their lives, I think is really powerful.
Well, rather than just assign somebody to answer, why don't anybody who wants to chip in on this one with a personal experience of intergenerational or historical trauma?
I can do that.
Okay.
Meryl,
Yes.
just real quick. I think what a lot of us know, many tribes, we're losing our language. And my father, he, as a young man, when he first went to school, he couldn't speak English at all, because, as a lot of people may know, he was raised by his grandparents. Even though his parents were there, it's kind of like they gave the older child to the grandparents once they were a little bit older, and that person would help them. And so he told me, he told us, we knew that he was slapped and hit so that he would speak English. And so when I was growing up, and I'd ask, Dad, how do you say this? Or what is, he knew the language, but he'd always say to me, go ask your grandparents. Because I feel like he felt like he didn't want to teach me that if those same things might happen to me. So I would ask my grandparents, and one day it was clear until I was, didn't realize the difference, but my grandparents always spoke to each other in Rikra, but they didn't speak to us because they knew we didn't know. So I said to my grandfather, who's pretty quiet, one day, Grandpa, I just want you to speak just into me. And so he did. And where he started that out was like at the table when we'd eat. And he taught me, all the things on the table that would be there from meat to potatoes and such, or badad, isidao, like bread, all these, I know all these things. And now growing up, I've been trying to learn more of that language from other people. And so to me, that's a really personal experience of that. And our language is almost dying from the Rikra, but we're trying to keep that going now. We have so very few native speakers in a Rikra on our reservation that are left, or elders. So.
Thank you. Now, Holly, I see you nodding and smiling here as Sharon was sharing there. So it looks as though you have something to add to this, and then Whitney will ask for you next.
Yeah, I just so I do federal policy analysis. It's not like sexy or cool. It's just what it is. And so when I hear people speaking about language in particular, right, I often think that so many non-natives have no understanding whatsoever that it wasn't until 1975 that we had the Indian Reorganization and Education Act. Right? So, and prior to that, we had a policy of termination in our country. It wasn't until 1978 that Sharon's father would have been legally allowed to practice and teach his ceremonies to his children. And so we have multiple generations of families who have been irreparably harmed. And then, non-native people might think, why didn't you do something? Why didn't you teach your children? Why didn't you this? Why didn't you that? And that abuse, right, in schools is a real thing. Where I know when I was growing up, I'm smiling because my personal story is very much related to language as well. My mother would teach me everything about what it meant to be Cheyenne, and then I was forbidden to speak the language, and I was forbidden to even think about a relationship with a native person. The expectation is that I would marry a white man, and I would make sure that I did everything that I could in order to make sure that I had a family and children who could be successful because they weren't native. And so I was always very confused as to why all of this was so important. And then when I was hungry for language and culture, to this day, she won't tell me very much at all. And I know now that that is that history of abuse over time. And 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 compounding that, right? We think about the ways that with Brandon's family, with alcoholism, the way that it compounds it, right? With sexual violence and sexual violence against children, the ways that all of these things have been compounding within our communities, the ways that we are severed because people are just trying to cope and exist within these federal shackles, and then we're blamed, right, for the outcomes of these structures that we didn't create and we don't maintain and we actively seek to dismantle. And so for me, I had to go back to my home reservation. My mother was unfortunately, she's a drug addict and an alcoholic, and she's been homeless most of my life when she wasn't in prison, and continues to this day, right, to be so. And I always have to extend her a considerable amount of grace because I used to blame her because of her behaviors. My father, who is white, actually organized with my first grade teacher to kidnap me and take me as far away from the reservation as possible, because my mother would take me from him and take me onto the reservation, and then sometimes she would forget where I was. It was a very unhealthy environment. There was random cycles of abuse that happen to children when parents aren't around to protect them. And so when I think about intergenerational trauma from a personal perspective, I think about all that we've lost, but then I also think about all of the ways that we are not kind, right, to our older generations for not teaching when we don't think about exactly why they could not teach. And at times their lives could be threatened, right, if they did not teach us. And so I've always been frustrated that I had to go back as an adult then to teach in my home school district, and struggle to learn the language and struggle to learn the culture, and then you're never accepted, right? And so within our own communities, right, we have these hierarchies that we build where if you left, like, we don't think about why people leave and why they might come back, or we don't think about leaving as survival at times. Or I know a lot of people that I'm friends with, they leave and get their education because that's what we're told we should do. And then we have to go work in other tribal communities in order to make a difference because there's this idea that you've assimilated. And so I think that trauma plays out in all of those pieces in our colonized thinking, where we've figured out how to establish Indigenous Peoples Days. We've done all of this really great work, but there's this last hurdle, right? When we're talking about decolonize, where we have to decolonize our thinking and extend grace, right? More than judgment to people, and particularly those who, I just think, like Sharon, right, has worked so hard, and I've heard so much about Whitney. Brendan, unfortunately, I just heard of you today, but I'm super excited to get to know you more. But I'm really concerned and yet hopeful, right, when we all have these stories, and we tell our stories in these spaces, and then those stories get lost when we're in the field doing the work, and then we fall into those old colonized thinking habits. And so I think if we can figure out how to decolonize thinking early with our Native children in schools, and then maintain that, right, and continue to think about that. And this is in this wave of lands being taken, like genocide, Christianity being superimposed, right? So there's multiple ideological pieces that are overlapping that reify that colonized thinking as well. But you know, we don't do a good job of teaching the why behind the outcomes. And I think that Sharon's story just really resonated with me when she was talking, because I think so much about like my heart, like for her dad, when, you know, as a father, he desperately wanted to teach her. And he was so afraid of her experiencing violence as a result of his teaching that he was stuck in the space of not being able to move left or right.
Thank you, Holly. Now, Whitney, if you would like to chime in on this and have a personal experience that would further define this, you're certainly welcome to do that now.
Yeah, so a couple of things came to mind for me, but as Holly was talking, I was thinking of, I've had those same thoughts about how we have these kind of, there's these, yeah, this hierarchy of like within in our own peoples, and probably, you know, a job that, you know, I love my job right now, but a job that will always hold a special place in my heart was the job I did right before being a psych NP at Family Healthcare, and that was the 6 years I spent as a nurse for homeless hall services. And there I found, well, one, the courage to go to graduate school at the urging of people I worked with, but unfortunately, you know, in the homeless population, Fargo-Moorhead, Native American people are overrepresented, meaning that, or disproportionately represented, meaning that for the population that we occupy for like the state of North Dakota, the proportion of us that are homeless shouldn't be that. It's higher than expected. And so I had a lot of contact with Native people. In fact, the Pendleton coach behind me, who I can't point with this webcam there. Now I'm pointing the right way. I was pointing the other opposite direction. Was a gift from family from a patient of mine that passed away in an apartment fire, and she was probably one of my favorite people in the whole world. She was a pretty neat Ojibwe lady from Pine Point. And anyway, just the stories that these patients that I took care of had, and also the lack of access. Even if they had a lot of access to our cultures when they were young, they didn't have them then anymore, because they had a hard time accessing them because they had history of being incarcerated or of periodically using drugs or alcohol, and kind of being I guess rough around the edges, and not feeling like they belonged at community events and stuff. And so me and some colleagues in the community have really tried to encourage them to attend events, and still do, because we really believe in empowering people. And so along the way, I met a gentleman who was such I'm trying to think of a non-swear word. He was so unpleasant to me when we first met, but that's not something that's ever bothered me, because I guess I get why our people put professionals through the ringer, because you want to make sure that people are going to stick around, that they're not just there for like loan repayment or whatever. So yeah, I mean, he was putting me through the ringer to make sure I was going to stick around, as nobody really had, or has this whole life. And with that, like kind of an empowerment and like in nurturing, you know, even without having like much of my own culture, but just like that sharing that I see that community do and cohesiveness that our homeless community has. It's like a huge family. And I've seen that person grow to be someone who is, you know, able to get an apartment anywhere they want because they don't have a credible rent history. He and I actually presented together at the harm reduction conference in Monoman a few years ago, like as colleagues rather than my patient anymore, which is probably one of the coolest moments ever. And yeah, so I think that that's like a happy ending in intergenerational trauma that is an example of the fact that, you know, the really, you know, the well-intended things that, you know, are not, that don't have they don't have the inclusion of our people in them, I think are very unlikely to be meaningful to everybody, because I think there is some like need for there to be Native nurses and social workers and educators and surgical technicians, and, you know, so that there's someone there in that community. Because I you know, I think it's important to note that I have had colleagues that are Caucasian that have said, my gosh, it's such a nice time to be working in this community right now because there's Native professionals and we had no idea how to help people. Like we were doing a bad job and we didn't know what the answers were. And we were always thinking the people that know the answers and that will be able to tell us how to structure things and can be that listening ear are not here yet. And that's something that is needed. So it's not really about like taking over, or like, it's just about like building some unity and, you know, inclusivity. I think that's very important. I just want to end on the note that I do have to step out early because I have patients to see this afternoon, but I thank everybody for coming today and all the panelists, and again, Meryl for being our moderator, and happy Indigenous Peoples Day.
Thank you, Whitney. And we
Thank you,
appreciate you
Whitney.
showing up
Same to
today
you.
for being here, but also for the work that you do and where you're headed off to. Before we go on, you know, and if either of the three of you who are remaining, Brandon, Holly, and Karen, if you have something that you want to share, and maybe we'll do that in a second. We'll just go to that rather than just taking questions. If there's something on your mind that you think is important for our discussion today, I'll ask you to bring it up. So think about that while I share this comment from one of our participants, Darlene Zackerly, mentioned that generational, she used the chat box to forward this to Catlin. Generational trauma to me, this is from Darlene, is a way of lifestyle being interrupted or taken away, leaving a group, hold them together to learn life skills. Coping mechanisms are put in place or taught, and individuals find self-medication, hence the introduction of alcohol and alcoholism. Many of our young grow up in this ill way of life and accept it as being native, which is totally what we are. So that is sad, as Darlene. Either comment on that, or if there's something that you'd like our people to know, our people, and why I mean is gosh, we've gotten up to 50 attendees today. Outstanding. You have something that you want to comment that Darlene made, or what I'd like to know, what would you like our 50 attendees to this panel today? You know? And Brandon, do you want to kick us off on this one?
I think the biggest thing I'd like to convey to our attendees is that you know, being Indigenous and being Native is not necessarily one thing. It's a big, broad umbrella for like many different nations in our country. There's a lot of different traditions, a lot of different practices, and like, you know, you can't say that this is Native American, like just in general, because different people have different beliefs and practices. And with that being said, I just, you know, I appreciate people coming here and learning about intergenerational trauma, because it's something that affects the day-to-day. So if there are professionals here working with Indigenous youth or Indigenous people in general, just understanding that there's more to the story than what you're seeing. You know, if you're seeing some sort of like something labeled as maladaptive behavior, or you know, disorderly conduct or something, you know, it's not just this moment that you're dealing with in a person's life. It's all the moments prior and all the different things that they carry with them. Not to say that, you know, we should let people, you know, be disruptive or whatever, but it's understanding and having compassion, and just knowing that there's way more to the story, and trying to learn what you can about that, so you can approach people in a way that's compassionate and caring.
Thank you, Brandon. Sharon or Holly, anything? And it kind of sounds like a wrap-up word, but we're not by any means wrapping things up here yet. Anything you personally want to convey about what we're talking about today?
I mean, I kind of missed the first, I had to step away for a second, but you know, just I think what Brandon says is really important, and it's also something like I'm always thinking about what's not. And you know, to know that we have 574 federally recognized tribes is to know that we also then have that many languages, that many histories, that many cultures, and so the ways that we kind of lump in, right, everybody into one monolithic culture is dangerous. And I also think that so from a Native perspective, I think it's also dangerous when we don't take the time to learn the histories and experiences of our fellow tribal communities. Okay, so being Indigenous, we often assume we know what it means to be Indigenous because we're Native, right? Like I have the card, it says I'm Native, I'm Native. And so the one thing, you know, when I was watching this film, I was so grateful, and kind of a little shout out to tribal historic preservation officers and tribal historians, because they do not get much credit, and they do a tremendous amount of work. When it comes to our pipeline fights, because they're the only ones that can put the like official information into BLM and the government, right? Like all these ways. But then it occurred to me, like I feel, because of what I do for a living, and because I work with faculty across the country, and I've worked in tribal communities across the country, and I work with legislators in 10 states, right, and the federal government in terms of crafting policy. Like I feel like I know quite a bit, and it occurred to me watching this movie that we still don't know the very, very important histories of our fellow tribal communities. And we also need to think about that, because we don't have a general understanding, you know, for example, of the ways people will say, you know, perhaps Navajo, right? Navajo, they have strong language, right? And so we want to emulate Navajo. And that's a great idea. What we don't think about is the difference between the treaties that placed us in the north and the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo that protected their lands, their water, and their languages. Okay, and so I think that it's important for us to really, when we're talking about education, to take it apart differently. Because the one thing that I just kept watching that movie thinking, like, I wish I had known this, because I have plenty of friends from up there. Like, you know, I interact with folks all of the time, but I didn't know that. And that's a critical story that shaped their entire community. And then speaking back to Brandon's point, it's also something that took 60 years. And then we're talking about basketball trophy. 60 years, right, for non-natives to understand the significance of that, because it's a basketball trophy. But for us, right, it's community. It's how we live our values. You can see in those young men the ways that they were happy with second place because it was there, right? They spoke of the ways they would help their opponents up. And so just the way they speak about the men on that basketball team, and the ways that the tribe fought to get a trophy, right? Because it was so much more. It represented a way of life. It represented success. It represented all of the values that make our communities what they are, right? And so I feel as if we're still, expected to think 60 years is a reasonable amount of time to wait, right? That it's reasonable for us to just get the little crumbs off the table that non-natives will throw us, or it's reasonable for them to teach, say, Thanksgiving slightly differently, even though they're still teaching it completely inaccurately, right? The way that they talk about North Dakota history, right? The ways that our tribes are largely omitted in a meaningful way, right? Through the lens of others. And so for me, when we're talking about intergenerational trauma, I said it when I started, like those are the things that really continue to reinforce that. So we have made these steps, but when we think about compulsory education and all kids needing to go to school, right, the ways that we don't recognize just how significant things are in the moment, and then we try to take 60 years, right, to fix it, like is problematic for me. And I think, like, what is happening now today? Like, what's happening to a student right now, whether in high flex or online or in-person schools in North Dakota today? What is happening to one student that might take us 60 years to fix? Because for those young men, it was this basketball tournament that then took that long, right? So what are we teaching that we're going to have to take 60 years to unteach, and we might get to it in somebody's grandchildren? Right? What are we doing on a daily basis? And as educators, I was a classroom teacher. I went to grad school, and now I'm in principal preparation. And I ask my students this often, like, at what point do we stop saying like, oh, that was really awful, what happened to people, and actively take steps to correct the mistakes, as opposed to falling into our comfort zones of like, well, we allow the students to wear their feathers and paint up for us and dress for us, so we are allowed to perform for you, but we aren't allowed to be meaningfully included into curriculum. We're not meaningfully addressed in any way, shape, or form, which is just increasing that trauma. Or then, say, well, Navajo have their languages. Like, why couldn't the Anishinaabe retain their language the same way that the Navajo did, somehow putting us in competition with each other when it's not even the same game? And so I think that it's important that our schools and our educators teach this, because that's part of the intergenerational trauma, when you want to highlight only the success stories, right? Like the great man theory. Like, we only put in the heroes and the super accomplishments of some tribes and some tribal communities, when we're not looking at the everyday accomplishments of all of the tribes and why those are different. Why NHA is different from Anishinaabe, which is different from Northern Cheyenne, which is different from Zuni. And so I think those are the pieces, and we have the expertise within our community to write the curriculum, to put it in. It's really just a matter of will. And when we have schools that are controlled by state legislatures and school boards, right? Because this isn't included, this isn't a matter of being forgotten anymore. This is a matter of intentionally deciding that these people are not important enough to include. Their voices don't matter. They're not as smart as we are at writing curriculum, right? And so I think that is something that, if we're going to address intergenerational trauma, the first thing that has to change is this idea that our voices can't be at the table in all of these educational matters, because it's the only place that we can really access kids and get into these issues with them, and then connect them with social services, and connect them with cultural experiences, and connect them with health, and really get all of these wraparound pieces together. So in a contemporary context, we're not having to have marches for missing and murdered Indigenous people, because we can backtrack to educational achievement, like foster care, social services, domestic violence, all of the factors that get us with missing and murdered, all of the factors that get us with loss of language. Like, all of these things come together in very unique ways, and we have strategies for that. And if you look at the White House initiative on American Indian and Alaska Native education, there was a listening session at Standing Rock that tribal leaders from across the state gave very concrete ways that the federal government could actually live up to the promises within the Indian Self-Determination and Education Act, rather than keep it bound up in contract law, right? To advocate for self-determination and sovereignty. And so I think that because, this is also focusing on education as it relates to trauma, right? We have to think about the ways that We better serve our kids holistically within schools. We better serve their understanding of tribal sovereignty and self-determination. We help them understand the ways that IHS just keeps you alive rather than helps you thrive, right? We have to help them understand the way that self-determination is shackled in contract law. So your self-determination is limited by what the federal government goals and outcomes are. Right? And so until we start to teach our kids these things, we can't really dismantle a lot of the trauma because we keep them in the dark about the things that are most relevant and most critical to understanding how to decolonize their thinking and dismantle, right, all of those things they believe, those myths and distortions that are untrue about themselves. And we can't do that without thinking about how teaching self-determination, sovereignty, and all of the different contours fits in with that. Got on a soapbox for a minute there, but
Yeah, good so much. You know, for
feels
I,
right with all of this.
I have to appreciate how you can put into very understandable language very complicated issues, and appreciate your ability to and Sharon, what started off this particular round was just, you know, do you have a personal something that you would like to communicate to our panel today about the subject?
I guess I want to start by just saying that the boarding schools are still here. When I say I was part of the end of the boarding school era, I mean where not today, not as many Native children are sent to boarding schools, but I was when I was very young. I was in the second grade, and I was 6 years old then. So if you can imagine, if any of you have a 6-year-old or 7-year-old, that's if we were sending them away. And some, you know, I was in the Catholic school system. And that was really hard for me because it was totally a different world there. But that's kind of one of the, I still have a lot of things from that. But the other couple of things I want you to remember is when we talked about the water, my grandfather, I used to love to look at William J. Dean Jr. I used to love to look at his license for his driver's license because he was born in the 1800s. And I thought that was so cool. You know, it had 1896 on there. And so then we'd go down to the river down, well, you call it Lake Sakakawea now, but we'd go down to the Missouri River there, and we'd be out there during the day, and he was getting older, and we'd put up a shade for him. We'd be around there. We might eat something, and he'd say, when we get ready to leave, now make sure you pick up everything, he said, because one day this water is going to be worth more than gasoline. And that's exactly how it is. Mm-hmm. You pay more sometimes for water in the store than you do for a gallon of gas. But that was their way of thinking, because even then, look how much gasoline was back in the early 70s. You know, that's about the time when we would go with him. So those are some of the things that our elders knew what was going on. Maybe they didn't have your bachelor's degree or your PhD, but they had life experience, and they had their ancestors' experiences, the things that were passed down to them, that they knew what it was worth, and we knew what the water was worth to us. So it was so traumatizing for me to have to even deal with the fact that somebody wanted to come and get this water and just spoil it when they would never live here. They won't know what it's going to be like to live here if we don't have clean water. They will have no idea that it didn't matter to them. And the other thing I just want to share is how significant, how early we get those connections. I tell the story about my son. When he first moved to Fargo area, we got connected with the powwow that the High Plains Woodland and High Plains powwow they had here, and so we'd go to meetings, And it was usually in the evening. And a lot of times I would just have to pick up my son and we'd go to the meeting. I'd grab some McDonald's or something for him, and we'd end up going to the meeting, and then he might just sit around and play, didn't, you know, bother anybody. But there was a lot of Native people in there from the different colleges, from the community, people that were helping to plan this. And then we, you know, he had grown up at home since he was 3. And so he knew the relatives, the grandmas, the aunts, the uncles. And then one evening, I went to go to the meeting, and some of my friends had car trouble. So I helped them, and I was late to the meeting, but I took them anyway. And I parked right there at the building, and I said, well, let me go see if they're still having this meeting, if it's over or not. So I locked them in there. I ran up the stairs, and they were just getting up. They were all getting ready to leave. And so I said, okay, you know, so I ran back out, and I started to get in the car. And he started crying and crying. I said, what's the matter? And he said, I wanted to see those Indians. That's how much, even just being in that area, listening to them, that camaraderie or that feeling, that's how close he was already to that, even as a 3-year-old. And I learned from him that day. So those are some things that, you know, I'm always trying to teach him, and I try to teach him his Lakota language. Like you were saying, we didn't try to learn the other tribes' things, traditions and stuff. Well, some people do, and I remember my grandmother, Leona Yellowbird Dean. It may sound kind of funny, but she used to say, "Now, when you're around somebody else, you go to the other places, you learn their language, so they can't talk about you." That's what she would tell me. So thank you.
You know, Sharon, I think that's really important. And I know we probably have other questions to get to, but I've experienced the same thing where like my partner is Blackfeet, Little Shell, Nakota, and Oglala. And I'm more fluent now, it seems, in Blackfeet and Oglala and Pekuni, or the Pekuni is Blackfeet, I'm sorry, and the Lakota and the Nakota, just by default when you're around the people. And I learning the language, I think, is the first step to learning, right, their histories. And I didn't mean to laugh at you. I just like I say
No,
like
I understand, because
it's not laughing at you, like getting going, and it's hard. The language, of course, like when you're with a Cheyenne person, this just a joke. People are like, that one's too hard, right? Like, that's
And I learned too. I learned the Lakota language, many of the words, along with my son.
yeah. Well, and we're still fighting this. You know, I think you keep bringing up water, and I don't think people realize how important that is. Okay, so we're talking about intergenerational trauma. You share your stories. What we are not thinking about is that same water that your grandparents are telling you fight for, right? Is 2/3 of the water supply for the entire nation today. Okay, when we're talking about these pipelines that are coming, Standing Rock, we have the governor of North Dakota who says that the George Floyd protest in Fargo was the largest protest in North Dakota history. And those of us there were saying, did you not see Standing Rock? Right? Because that was a lot bigger than the Fargo protest was. Right? When we have this people, they play down water because it's politically advantageous on one hand, right? But I think that in many ways, if people are unwilling to acknowledge how important that water is, right, then they never have to hold themselves accountable. And what I see within our tribal communities are all of these people who want to be accountable, and they want to be accountable for the water, and they want to be accountable into the future. And so we see politically it's advantageous for people who do not value that, right, to paint Native people as looters and rioters and radicals, when I don't see how it's radical to want to protect the water supply that is for 2/3 of the nation. We're not just fighting for Native people or Native water rights. We're fighting for the health and welfare and safety of all people. So those who experience different types of intergenerational trauma unrelated to being Indigenous also benefit from at least having healthy water. Right? And I think that part is lost in the conversation. I appreciate how you keep bringing it back to the water, because I think it's so important, so important.
And thank you, Holly, for bringing that up as well. It was one of the questions submitted by our attendees to the panel today as well, about the importance of water. And thanks for bringing up the film again too, in your previous sharing, and because it is a big part of the film too. It's about water in the lost city of Leibowitz. Catalin asked me to remind you to give you some more details. There's a 5 p.m. event tonight, and it is an Indigenous Peoples Day keynote and live panel. Again, if you don't get enough of panels here yet this afternoon, 5 p.m. via Facebook at the Indigenous Association. So keep that in mind. And the keynote speaker is Tyrell Ironize, sharing about Indigenous language revitalization. And he will be on a live panel tonight. Again, that's 5 p.m. And scrolling down here, Indigenous Peoples Day keynote and live panel via Facebook. And we have a comment here from Susan Smith.
Isn't that panel though, Sharon, aren't you on the panel too?
Yes,
Yeah, so it's
I am on that panel.
yeah, Tyrell and Sharon, and then Brandy King, woman combat vet, like LGBTQ activist.
Yes.
I'm excited.
Thank
you can see
you.
I put that in my calendar already, right before they even asked me for this. I'm like, oh.
Awesome.
Yeah.
So again, is that correct? Live via Facebook?
I wasn't trying to
Yes.
correct you at all. Sometimes
No.
you get really excited. I think that you've got it at this point. Try to be all like stoic, and it's a panel, we're learning, but this is exciting stuff, and it's stuff that hasn't happened in the past, and you get to hear from all of these phenomenal human beings who are in our region. So to me, this is as good as my day can get right now, and I get this great thing to look forward to.
No, and I'm not too sensitive, so don't worry about talking to me or about me or anything like that. So yeah, 5 o'clock tonight, and you can get in on that. And there was a comment today from someone, from Susan Smith, who is currently writing the curriculum for the, pardon my pronunciation here, I'll give it a shot, the Tolowa tribe. Susan says, I'm writing a teacher's manual, a student handbook, and a workbook for children. We're trying to revitalize the language on the reservation. Our teachers at Head Start are getting language lessons weekly. Maybe you can help me out with that. I'm just curious. The Tolowa tribe, Susan, you can either chat us or maybe one of our panelists knows. Where is that? So if you can put that in there, that'd be great. Speaking of which, another question or a suggestion from people attending today was, what are the best advocacy tools? And hey, by the way, I appreciate it, Holly, the freewheeling exchange and discussion. Really, please feel free to do that anytime. I'm just here to kind of get things going and keep it rolling. That's important.
You're actually the best moderator I've ever heard. Like, you are really good at this.
At least this afternoon, right? The best moderator to be moderating this discussion this afternoon. Thank you.
No,
Well,
like I do a lot of panels. You're in the top 1%.
Well, thank you. Appreciate that. There's no substitute for experience. So not that I'm a professional panel moderator, but just being around and having an extreme interest in the topic too. So what somebody wants to know is, what are the best advocacy tools that we can use to create change today? And I think change, or maybe awareness, is another word. Brandon, we haven't heard from you lately, but you're working with the youth. What are some of the tools that be out here, or the professionals that are part of this panel? We've got a wide variety of people involved in this topic. What are some of the tools that we can use?
So I think one of the biggest things is working with the youth. The youth have a lot of ideas. They're really smart and they have a lot of passion about things. Um, from what I understand, the No Dapple movement was really youth driven. You can correct me if I'm wrong on that, but it started off that way, and from what I understand. But what I think one of the best advocacy tools is having youth find things that they're passionate about, find things that in the culture that they get excited about, and have them be the ambassadors to some of those things, not in like an exploitative way. I didn't say that right. You know what I mean? Not in a way that will exploit them, but in a way that they can share their passion with the world. Because I feel like the world responds really well to young people that are passionate about things. So that's a huge advocacy. And then there's, you can get bigger and more macro, like, being present where they're making decisions that affect us is really important, either like politically or, in advocacy, and just being willing to share the perspective of your community or of yourself and be heard is really important as well.
Anyone else? Sharon, Holly? Oh,
Well, I mean, so yesterday I had the pleasure of participating in a Rename Custer Park event in Bismarck, right? And there's a group of young Indigenous people, extremely ambitious and talented and smart, right, who have been trying to organize these things. And I think, like Brandon said, so many of these big movements, right, are oftentimes initiated by youth. And yesterday I learned that the woman who had organized the event was actually inspired to do so because of her daughter asking questions. And so she gave her daughter an opportunity to speak. And the one thing I think that we're doing well is talking about these issues. What we're not doing well is actually showing up, right, and supporting people when we can do so. And I know that can be difficult, right? Not everybody can just like drive to Bismarck for a Sunday night rally. But I was really disappointed even within Bismarck how few people showed up. And I don't think it's that people don't care. It's that I don't think that it's like voting, right? Like if you think your vote doesn't count, or, there's going to be plenty of people doing it, so I don't need to do it. And the one thing I have learned continuously from youth, aside from all of it, like there's the policy pieces, there's the things that we know, right? But I think in a perspective of actually doing something meaningful in the moment with youth is supporting them and not telling them how to do it, right? Not stepping up and speaking at the microphone because you're super important or super famous, right? And so the program yesterday I thought was really remarkable because it was those young people who selected the speakers. It was those young people who determined what was going to happen. And you saw, and it was remarkable speakers, right, from all over, right? And but I think that what we don't do is show up, right? Oftentimes, and I don't think that showing up at protests or demonstrations is the answer. Don't get me wrong. I think it's one very small part, right, of actually enacting systemic change. But I think when you are young and you are wanting to make a difference, you have so few tools in your toolkit and so little access to those systems and structures that you do what you can do in the space where you're effective. And I think if we showed up more for youth when they're organizing, or set up different ways for them to learn and then mobilize themselves, or teach them how to engage in advocacy and activism in a way that is productive and helpful, right, and can help them in their future, right? Really facilitating all of those things, as opposed to, kind of falling back on what we know and doing the same things. I think that that's really important. And it shows youth that even if it goes sideways, right? I mean, some things might not be well planned, but they sure did a lot of work planning it. And that's a learning opportunity for them, and helping them understand that it's okay to not be 100% successful, right? That it's a long game and it's a long movement. And so in order for us to dismantle all of this trauma, like when you're talking 60 years for a basketball trophy, right? Then what does this mean for water? What does this mean for education? What does this mean for self-determination, right? And so we need to help support our kids in everything that they're doing, because they're in it for a much longer haul, right, than we're going to be left in it because we're so much older than they are.
Sharon, a comment, final comment on this topic?
Tell me again what you were talking about.
Oh,
Advocacy
how am I
for
supposed to remember that? I just asked the
education.
questions. No.
Okay.
Yeah, well, yeah, about other tools in communicating this and to young people too, about advocacy tools.
Yep. Well, I think one of them is, the elders that we have in our communities are some of the best tools. Before they're gone, literally is how you look at it. I was fortunate enough to have both sets of my grandparents, till I was at least a teenager, and then some of them until I was in my until I was a teenager. By the time I was 19, both sets of my grandparents had passed away. But I think because one of the things my mom says to me is, we're pitiful. It's tough because we don't know our real history. We don't know everything. We don't know how they really used to do it because so much of it has changed, even with our different traditions and okay, we do it like this now, or we do it. And then somebody might say to you, oh, that's not the right way. And then I don't look at it like that ever, because whatever they're doing, that's the way, what they know. And that's what my mom's, why she means that is she said, we don't know everything now. So when you do the best you can, then that's how you do it. You do what you know, but to at least pass that on now to our children. So it's the people that before we lose that, it's almost like that last generation before us. And again, depending on what tribe, like you're saying, and did you find out which tribe this is, which part of state they're in, or I apologize, I don't know this tribe that she was, Mrs. Smith was talking about. And that just, that shows, like, especially coming from the east to the west, a lot of those tribes, there isn't even anybody left. And we say we have over 500 tribes. Well, we have more than that, but some of them are not recognized by the United States anymore. They don't have a piece of land or reservation that was set aside for them and they were put there. There's recently been tribes that are trying to get back into being recognized. But I'd say that the elderly people are some of your best advocates, and parents, because I think the next generation of parents, maybe like my age and the next generation, they're trying to get that back. They're trying to share their culture that they've learned as much as they can. And so I think that's a place you could start when you want to have advocacy. And then, yes, to just always encourage them, be part of their events, students or children. I think those are some of the best ways to do it, especially to participate and encourage them. Don't say, okay, this was wrong or you didn't do that right. Help them to be proud of who they are. And just like how we say, empower them, and how I feel about that. That is, when you let somebody be themselves, criticism or making them feel like they couldn't talk or, bring out their idea or their strengths that are within them. So to me, that's what we can do to help advocate for the students. Thank you.
Thank you, Sharon. And you did bring up Susan Smith again, who was working with the youth of the Tolowa tribe, and she did chip in when I asked for some information about it. She says we're a tribe in Northern California on the coast, 2 miles south of the Oregon border, Smith River, California, which brings to mind it's interesting. I would wager that Susan Smith would not be part of this panel were it not for the technology
Mhm.
that we are,
Oh,
so many of
thanks a
us are
lot.
using today. So there certainly are
You're
benefits.
welcome.
Yeah. So I go to other meetings that people from Arizona and Texas check in with who they used to live up here, and they wouldn't be here in person. So I'm sure some of this technology will stick with us through this pandemic disaster that we are all going through. A couple of things that Catlin wanted me to remind you of, and that is the complete the documentary reflections worksheet and the course evaluation. And all are encouraged to complete, but it is not, I believe it's not required for all participants. Oh, it is required for participants who want CEU credit. Okay, let me repeat that. Complete the reflections worksheet and the course evaluation. All are encouraged to complete it, but it is required for participants who want those CEU credits. So I'm sure you can see it there. That's very good. Let me ask you this. I think, Holly, you may have kind of briefly alluded to this earlier. Now, I don't know what is at the crux of, or what's the teeth in Savannah's law, which was a law introduced by North Dakota Senator Heidi Heitkamp when she was not reelected. Fellow Senator, I forget from which state, a woman from a Midwestern state, could be Kansas, Nebraska, that way. But at any rate, pardon me?
Sharice David, and now I'm blanking on the woman in New Mexico.
Okay, well, at any rate, thank you. It was carried on. It wasn't left to drop just because Heidi Heitkamp wasn't in the Senate. But, and then I believe just maybe yesterday, the president actually signed it into law. Now, what I do know, one of the ramifications of it is that it brings to light and will hopefully discontinue kind of the laissez-faire or the indifference, let's say indifference to missing or murdered Indigenous women. Now, I don't know, I mean, other than that, I don't know what the positive movement will be on this, what it actually means is going to be done, but it will, that's the intent, is to shine a light on the missing and murdered Indigenous women. And I would like you to share a little bit about, what is the importance of Savannah's law now that it is indeed law. And Holly, you're the one who said something that kind of brought it to mind. Do you want to share on that a little bit?
Yeah. So I think being in Fargo in particular, there aren't many days that I don't think of Savannah Graywin. And just backing that up, so I've worked with a number of states on missing and murdered Indigenous women and now Indigenous persons, right, issues for a long time. And I think that, as originally written, Savannah's Act wouldn't have actually helped, right, at all, right, in Savannah's case, because it is not tribal jurisdiction, it's not falling under Major Crimes Act. And so it was revised. And to that end, I think that there's something good in that, right? I know that it sets up, I believe 6 technical assistance centers, right, across the country to help assist with investigations. And I think to that end, right, it's also important. I know that there is quite a bit of money. I think at 230 million, maybe something like that, attached with it. And I think that's where it gets a little bit misleading, because that money is going to be allocated into the technical resource centers. It's going to be allocated into BIA. It's going to be allocated, some's going to be set aside through NIJ and DOJ competitive grants, right? And so a tribe's ability to write grants is going to determine the degree to which they can access those funds. And then within that, again, much like a 638 contract, if you apply for a grant from the federal government, then the GIPRA outcomes, the goals, and the parameters of everything that is done is defined by non-natives for natives in how to address our community concerns. And so while I'm quite pleased that Savannah's Act passed, and I think just backing that up a little, so Hannah Harris is my cousin. And The National Day of Recognition for Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women is named after her, and it's on her birthday. And I've been very active as one of the searchers who found Henny Scott's body in 2018. And so my opinions on this don't come from any ideological framework, right? It comes from working actively with the FBI, with local law enforcement, with the federal government, with state legislatures, task forces that have no authority and don't actually have the ability to do anything, right? But they're symbolic. And I see Savannah's Act as a major win for recognition, but also very symbolic, right? Because we're still not going to be able to have the resources that we need on the prevention side. And so we have to figure out a way to take anything that we're doing, even Operation Lady Justice, which, speaking back to Sharon's discussion about water, when you're in the listening sessions and you want to bring up like extractive oil industries and the ways that those contribute, right? Nobody wants to have that conversation. They say it's outside the scope of the executive order establishing the Operation Lady Justice Task Force, and it's outside the scope of Savannah's Act. Right? So nobody is really talking about the root causes of MMIW, MMIP, however you frame it. And so while I do commend legislators, right, for the efforts to get these things passed, I know people work really hard on them. From the back end, right, we're not looking at disproportionate representation in foster care. We're not looking at disproportionate representation in prisons. We're not looking at disproportionate school discipline, right? We're not looking at all of the things that actually will cause people to be in a position later, right, in some circumstances, to end up missing or deceased. And so, like, this is a super long answer, and I know we don't have a lot of time, so I'm trying to condense it down. But we have these policy solutions. So written within Operation Lady Justice is using the NamUs database system, and there's a lot of misinformation and inaccurate research, right, being put out. So the only thing we know about missing and murdered comes from some reports that are factually inaccurate in many, many ways. So for example, there's one report that says there's over 5,000 missing and murdered, and only like 118 are actually in the federal database, when this misunderstanding that NamUs is the federal database that is for missing and murdered Indigenous people, and it's not, right? So NCIC is the federal database where over 5,000 people were represented in that data set, right? But NamUs was actually used to reconcile cold cases and John and Jane Does, and so it was never intended to be a database to log missing and or potentially murdered people, right? And so Savannah's Act is largely predicated on data from factually inaccurate research reports, that because we don't have the data, we don't know, right? And so the federal government advocates for using NamUs, but we don't actually have access to the data, so we don't have data sovereignty, and individual tribal communities don't have a way to address unique situations within their communities that contribute to missing and murdered Indigenous persons. So it's an act that largely consolidates everybody into one kind of heading as Indian, right? And makes it very symbolic. We're doing something to address it. But policies that don't think about prevention and intervention strategies, and I'm sure Brandon could speak to this at length. Like, if we're not talking about the complex set of factors that contribute to these crises in the first place, right, then we can't actually solve them. And then to not think about disaggregating the root causes, right, in terms of, I've seen a lot of research where it's trying to connect a whole bunch of different cases to the oil extraction industry, when like they're misleading. And when you do the math, right, none of the cases actually have anything to do with pipelines in that sense, right? But it has a lot to do with this intergenerational trauma we're talking about, like lack of education, lack of health care, right, foster care, all of these things. And so I think that in many ways, when we're trying to address this issue, we're really trying to make it far less complex than it is. And so we have awareness, and this does allow some leverage, right, for us to get some more things done. But fundamentally, all of the legislation is going to be like a lot of legislation, right? And it's going to be like bound within 5 years, and you can get funding for this, you can do this, but then what happens afterwards, right? Or we think about our rural communities, but like when I was on the Henny Scott search, we had to have a BIA officer come down from Browning because he was the closest one that we could get down. And I don't know if you're familiar with Montana, but that's like a 9-10 hour drive. right, to get someone down there. And it's been my experience that even working with the FBI, you know, they get a bad rap. And so we're trying to make it about strengthening law enforcement, right? And oftentimes the issue is within our own communities, and that is a result of intergenerational trauma. And it's probably the least well-received thing that I say. But, you know, when people want to get on the FBI for not pressing charges, right, they have to think about the fact that you have to have the evidentiary standing to do so. And so if we have communities who are unwilling to provide any evidence for what they know, right, then law enforcement is unable to press charges. And so I work with a group out of the Billings, Montana office, where it's a Native woman and Native liaisons, and they really are vested, and they've actually written grants to get millions of dollars in North Dakota, up in the Bakken area, just on their own time, not as part of the FBI. And what we find is these legislative pieces come kind of reactionary, and because they make constituents feel better. But when we want to think about the root causes and how to get at these things, nothing within the federal legislation is going to be very helpful, because like having more officers, right, might be one issue, but then how long are they going to be funded and sustained? Or you think about like the FBI office in Billings, where there's five agents, right? That's it. And they're supposed to cover all of it. And so to have people specifically put into Indian country, that's a win. But how many people can you possibly add, right, with the limited amount of money that's going to be put into that? And then who's supposed to absorb the costs later? And then thinking back again, then it's all within this federal framework of the federal government and those federal shackles under 638 contracts with your BIA police, right? Or thinking about jurisdictionally, like whether you're a public law 280 or whether you're not. So public law 280 preservations, right, are already supported through states differently. And so it kind of takes a blanket approach and groups us all in, and it doesn't talk about disestablished tribes. It doesn't talk about state recognized tribes. So what do we do for all of those people? And I see a far more effective way of addressing this is having people come together authentically, right? And another thing I say that's not very popular is we need people who are less interested in being Indian famous and more interested in doing the work, right? And I think when we bring our communities together and do the work, right, if we have some resources, that's fine, right? But I think that we have all that we need within our communities to get at these to begin with, when we have federal policy that, while symbolically appears to be helpful, right, when broken down into its individual components, is yet another program that is going to overburden tribes in different ways.
Thank you, Holly. Now, we do just have a few minutes left, but Brandon or Sharon, if you would just like to add a couple of brief comments to this, I'd appreciate that.
Yeah, I really believe that Holly's like right on track with like that reactionary system to like deal with these issues that we see. I see that all the time. I've worked in schools, I've worked in children's mental health, I've worked in street outreach, different places like that, and you see people throwing money toward things that they see as problems, the end result of a cascade of problems coming down the line. And yeah, it's really hard when you see the root causes of all these things being intergenerational trauma. Poverty is huge. I think poverty is like one of the biggest causes of a lot of these issues that we see. But instead of dealing with issues of poverty and intergenerational trauma and restoring some of the things that were taken from people, we go and try to put a band-aid on the last thing that happened. And it's very frustrating as a person who works with people who have gone throughout their life experiencing these things and not really having the ability to access services or access anything until they get to a certain point where it's really acute and they need help. Otherwise, it's going to drain another resource. So someone's decided that we can throw some money toward this, because if we don't, they're going to end up in prison, right? Like it's just all a calculation. And so I'm all for finding solutions that are tackling root problems and things. And it's not just in the Indigenous community. It's also like when I was watching this film, I was thinking about how the whole town is relocated. I grew up in the Twin Cities, like I said, and I grew up close to the I-94 corridor. And when that was being built, you had really successful, booming African-American towns just destroyed for the sake of progress, just like in the film with the dam. And I can't even imagine how many of those lives and paths changed overnight when they decided that that's where they were going to put it. And I can't imagine how many lives and paths changed once they decided to build the dam and divert the river and make a huge lake. So it's just like an overarching, like this is my overarching thought, like of this film and what our discussion today is, just to be aware of the things that are happening around us. There's lots of legislation that goes through. No one blinks an eye to say it's good, and you like, oh yeah, that's probably good. But underneath it, it's affecting a lot of people. So just be willing to look underneath and see how things affect other people, and advocate for people that might be affected, that might not have the voice to advocate for themselves as well.
Thank you, Brandon. And just like you said, the communities in the Twin Cities that you're referring to were split up by the interstate highway. The communities of the three affiliated tribes were just split in two. Half of them wound up on one side of the river, and half of your family might wind up on the other side of the river. And they're still dealing with those issues. So Sharon, we're rapidly approaching the end of our allotted time here. I see a few people are dropping off. They probably have 2 o'clock meetings, but if you would add a final word from your perspective, and we'll wrap her up. Thank you, Sharon. Sounds like I got a note here. It says we might be experiencing network connection difficulties. So I don't think that, yeah, we're not hearing you. Okay, well, yeah, Catlin, I guess we just aren't hearing Sharon. So can you nod if you can still hear me though, Sharon? Nope.
Sharon,
oh, she can hear me.
Sharon, try unmuting your mic.
I just now did, but it said that the organizer had taken me off, but still, here we go. We can hear you.
It's Catlin.
Savannah, so for the Savannah's law or act, that started here in Fargo. As we all know, there was such a horrible thing that happened here. But what the MMIW and Missing Murdered Indigenous Women, and then which we later changed to Missing Murdered Indigenous People, started here in Fargo. And we pushed for that. And we asked Ruth Buffalo, when she became the representative, to help push for that. And the reason we wanted that was because there was no documentation. When you asked for, like everybody always wants statistics. Okay, well, we can't do anything about this unless we know the statistics. So here we said, we don't have any, because no place in the country did they keep those statistics for Native peoples. So that's what we were pushing for, because at least it brings awareness to that, and it's someplace to start. And if, just like we were talking earlier today at our opening ceremony, that it takes people to start that. And then each of those people still need to keep pushing, as well as other people take part of that and do what you can to keep pushing, add to that. So that still affects me. And if you could see in my window right now, I still have my sign there, Justice for Savannah there. And I keep that there until I will leave this office. That will be on that window, because I feel that has been not very well done. But that's why it started. And it was started right here in Fargo. And I'm proud to say that, we pushed for that. So I'm glad that, we're going to try to be able to do something, but we all need to keep pushing with it and do the things that need to be added to it. Because of course, whenever you start something, you can't have every piece of it right now. You won't know every piece of it, but as the world starts to know, it will grow, and things will get better with it. So I hope that's where it goes to. Thank
Sharon,
you.
thank you. thank you so much for your final comments. And with that, we'll thank Sharon Whitebear and Holly Mackey and Brandon Beatty, and then Whitney Fear, who had to leave us just a little bit early. What an outstanding panel. I'm sure all of you who are participating here today appreciate a quality discussion. Again, a reminder to fill out the evaluation form, that's for those CEU credits, and the reflections also as well, if you would return those to Christy. And a thank you to Catlin Christie. And here's a little virtual applause for the panel and for Catlin, and for everybody joining here today. So Catlin, if that's it, I guess we'll just adjourn our panel, and don't forget about the 5 o'clock Facebook event as well. And our two of our participants who are here are going to be participating in that as well. Facebook at the Indigenous Association. So thank you everyone for joining it today. This is always great to learn more about it. I'm extremely interested. Thank you. Thank you for allowing me to moderate the panel as well.
Thank you, Meryl. Thank you to my co-panelists. Have a good rest of your day.
See you at 5.
Thank you.
Yes,
Bye-bye.
we'll see you at 5.
Yeah. Thank you.